So we are live now. Thank you everybody for coming. I think this is going to be really interesting because I think most of you will get to learn about a new country, right? So with us today we have Chrystello. Chrys is a Portuguese writer, translator, journalist. He was a journalist for many, many years. He told me that he worked with basically every single Portuguese newspaper. He lived in Australia, so he was a correspondent in Australia. So the accent you're going to hear today is the English Australian accent. He's going to say mate, I hope. Chrys lived in Timor for a significant amount of time, and he's going to tell you his story living there. He's going to tell you about Timor as a country, as a culture, and also what he feels about it, what he saw, what he still thinks about Timor, and he will also talk about the arts and the crafts and all the other fun things that Timor has to offer. So I'm going to pass the stage to Chrys. Thank you, Chrys, for coming. We are really happy to have you here.
As we say in Australia, good day, mate. I'm also an Australian citizen, and my accent is not too bad, so I hope you all understand. I started my career in journalism back in 1967, and in those days in Portugal, there was a dictatorship that started in 1926 and lasted until 1974. And I remember that back in 1972, a book of poetry, my first book, was published, and they censored about 68 pages, which was fairly bad for a very young writer like myself. But there was another problem. All the people of my age at the time in Portugal had to be conscripted into the war. It was the equivalent to your Vietnam War. We were conscripted to go and serve in the colonies against the liberation armies of the native people of Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and so on. I was fortunate enough not to go to Angola, Mozambique, or Guinea, but I went to East Timor, then called Portuguese Timor. And the colonial war lasted from 1961 until 1974. When I landed in Timor, I thought I was in the most remote and backward country in the world. It was worse than what I've seen from Africa. It looked like it had no civilization whatsoever. There was the aerodrome where we landed, and there were few huts, very few houses in brick and mortar, and all the land looked inhospitable, savage, primitive, and my first impression was terrible. There were 6 of us on that plane, and we all looked at each other and we said, oh, is this where we're gonna live for the next few years? So they put us in 1952 Bedford truck with wooden seats for the 6 of us, open, with a tarpaulin on top, and we took about 6.5 hours to drive from Baucau, the airport on the far right on that map, to Delhi, which was the capital right in the middle. And it was only 400 k's, 400 kilometers, but it looked like forever. And the worst part is that the road was no tarmac, no It was gravel, pebbles, rocks. Uh, well, they called it a road. But if you looked from the truck, you'd see the abyss below, about 1,000 meters down in a very steep cliffs to the sea. And there were no guards on the road. There was nothing to protect you. And of course, if you were with having some faith, you would be praying, because that's the sensation of that trip that I still remember vividly, although it's been 48 years now. Well, we arrived at Delhi, and Delhi had 16 kilometers of asphalt, bitumen roads. And Delhi was occupied during the Second World War by the Japanese, and they fought the, um, the Allies, they fought the Australian and Dutch, and thousands of Japanese lost their lives helping the Allies. The Allies were kicked out of East Timor, and there was a full occupation by the Japanese that lasted for 3 years. And the devastation was enormous. And what surprised me when I first arrived there is that road that you are watching now on the screen was built by the Japanese. And most of the road, this is a creek, and all the creeks had lost their bridges, so we had to cross and hope the water wouldn't take us away. And it was fearsome. It was hard. Uh, I went into the mountain. Here we are watching some pictures of the mountain, the roads, and it was even more primitive than Delhi. I lived there for 3 months. That's a truck. And I lived there for 3 months. And for a shower, we had a barrel of oil, fuel oil, cut in half. We would light a bonfire under the barrel with some bamboo. We had an aqueduct to carry the water into the bathroom, and we had a very tepid, not even warm shower. And that's how we lived there. And we had supplies sent from Delhi every 3 or 6 months, whenever the road was passable, and that's how we lived there. And the poor people there lived much worse than we did. At least we had a table, we had meals, we pretend to be civilized like we are watching now. There were about 12 army officers in that garrison, and there was not much in the mountains except riding horses and watch the wonderful landscapes. Timor is absolutely fabulous. I'll never forget the sunsets and the landscapes of East Timor. They are absolutely out of this world. Totally different from Indonesia, where I also lived. Totally different from the rest of Asia. I also lived in Macau and China for quite some years before settling down for good in Australia. And the landscapes are out of this world. The people are very friendly, and they are very friendly, but they surprised us when we arrived because they looked like they had blood on their lips. But it wasn't blood, it was a mix of a leaf like tobacco, areca, um, that they use to chew just to avoid feeling hungry. there's still lots of hunger in East Timor. The country is now very rich with oil reserves and billions of dollars in oil, but the people are still extremely poor. That's how they live in those houses, those huts, and they are extremely strong. They are able to withstand earthquakes. There are daily earthquakes in East Timor, and they are able to withstand lousy weather in the monsoon season from November till May. And after 3 months, I was able to be moved. That's Hotel Turismo in Delhi. I was able to move to Delhi, the capital, and as a conscript army officer, I did my duty, and my duty was to make sure that all military units in the territory had supplies, which I was fortunate enough to achieve, and they had supplies for 6 months, and they were independent from the bad roads and the weather. The Delhi airport was very funny because there were not many planes landing there, but before every plane landed, there was a jeep uh, just to get rid of the water buffaloes and the pigs and the cows and all sorts of animals that grazed on the aerodrome. And it's uh, it's really funny because before any plane landed, we saw the jeep going up and down and the animals running. The the roads were absolutely atrocious, even in Delhi, apart from those 16 kilometers of bitumen, of tarmac, the roads were gravel. And there were very few cars. I don't know exactly how many, but probably less than 50 cars at all in Delhi. And there were lots of military trucks, lots of motorbikes, and people just walked for miles and miles. The native Timorese would walk 10 or 20 kilometers from the mountains down to Delhi just to sell bananas or other fruits that they collected, and up they would go after selling those fruits. That house you are watching was my first apartment in there, and there was electric light probably 3 to 6 hours every day. Uh, we didn't have uh, energy supply. The water was existent, but not frequent. Everything was so primitive. But on the other hand, the people were lovely. They they were caring. Uh, they're very tender. They're very sweet. One of the sweetest people I've ever met. And they had a capacity, an immense capacity to withstand pain, as I'll explain later on. For instance, the dentist would go on the tarmac on one of the 4 or 5 aerodromes that we had in the territory, and there was a chair. The Timorese would sit there, and the dentist would extract the teeth without anesthesia, without anesthetics, without anything. And they wouldn't cry, they wouldn't shiver. I mean, they had a capacity to withstand pain that's totally alien to us Westerners, and that's one of the things that surprised me. For instance, when I was in the mountain, I was teaching school children, year 5 and 6, and they would walk the mountains for 3 or 4 hours in those mountain treks, and they would arrive there without breakfast, without anything. They would sit there for 3 hours, listen to the classes, and then go back home another 3 or 4 hours. It was amazing, but it was primitive. It was indeed uh, too primitive for my taste. Uh, the house building, as we've watched in some of those images, uh, it's um, it's quite curious. It varies from county to county. For instance, on the eastern part, the houses are like that. They all covered in bamboo or hay, and some of them are sacred. And their religion before they became independent and so on was animism, and they would worship various entities, and there would be a special house where they would have their worshipping, and they are quite superstitious. They would attribute anything to the bad and evil, and they would consider it um, just normal fate. They are very apt at arts and crafts. They they work a lot with silver filigree, which is a very thin work with silver for brooches, for um, earrings and bracelets and things like that. Their weaving of ties, which are a typical dress, uh, like like it's normal in Asia. Men and women use a certain type of skirt, the lipa or sarong, and they have wonderful patterns in that weaving, and totally different from the Indonesian batiks, and it's a different way of um, of preparing their clothes. Uh, After I arrived in Delhi, I was in charge of the local newspaper. There was only a newspaper. The radio worked a few hours. There was no TV. TV arrived many years after that. And it was very cumbersome to prepare a newspaper, a very small newspaper. When I first arrived, it had 4 pages. When I left, it had 24. And the technical means of printing were very primitive. We could do some collages, but on a very small size, like 4 inches or so, no bigger than that. And there was a problem, as I said before. There was censorship, so I had to be and tread very carefully because of the censorship. And a few months afterwards, there was the April Revolution of 1974 in Portugal, which brought us to democracy for the first time after 48 years of dictatorship. And unfortunately, the democracy didn't arrive. Probably it went by boat. It was a very slow steamboat, and it never arrived in Timor. So I was called every single day by the censors who protested against the articles that I was publishing on the newspaper that were censored, and I still published them. It was very hard. It was very hard. and it lasted for many months. And there was nothing I could do. I could keep on insisting on in publishing. At the same time, the first political parties were created, and there was an incipient elite. Not many people had studies. Very few people went to college in those days. I believe that when I first arrived in Timor, there were 2 or 3 people with degrees, and not many more. There were few studying in Lisbon, uh, but that's the sort of cultural background we had. Yet there were people interested in fighting for their rights and for their freedom and for independence. So the political parties were created, and at the same time, we knew Timor was very rich. Australia had tried to establish treaties with Portugal to exploit the oil reserves offshore. And Indonesia was also interested in coveting the riches of the oil in Timor Sea. Timor is only 400 k's away from Australia, from Darwin, which is fairly close. And all the Timor Sea is very rich in oil, and it was divided between the Portuguese and the Indonesians. Portugal granted some concessions to the Australians and to the Americans, but still there was no big exploitation, no offshore platforms working at the time I was there. Just to give you an example of how life was, our mail took 1 month to arrive from Europe. So whenever I wrote to my parents, I would receive a reply a month later, and I already forgot what I have told them in that letter. Probably I've already sent another 3 or 4 after that, and that's how long it took. But if you wanted no TV, there was no TV, but a player, a stereo player, or if you wanted a camera, it would come by boat, and it would take at least 6 months. You'd ask the boat when the boat came, and the boat would go to Singapore or Hong Kong or Australia and bring them back 3 months later. So everything was lacking, and there was not much. The the world at those days was dominated by the Cold War, and at the time in the States there was Mr. Henry Kissinger, which and he had this theory about the domino in politics, and that meant it was a time when Saigon fell and the Americans were defeated, and there was the fear that after Vietnam, if any other country succumbed, they would go one after the other like the domino. And so they were very worried about political parties in East Timor. They were very worried of what could happen, because East Timor is only half of the island. The other half was Indonesia. East Timor was the only part of Indonesia that was not part of the Dutch colonies, and they were worried. Australia was worried, Indonesia was worried, the States were worried, and contrary to what happened in Africa, where Russia and the States tried to divide and conquer through the liberation armies, In East Timor, there was no such interference from China or Russia, and the political parties were willing to wait 5 to 10 years before becoming independent. Then things start accelerating, and by August 75, they started a civil war. The two major parties started a civil war. Um, Hundreds of people were killed. Families were split, family against family, brother against brother. The Indonesians by then had prepared the invasion of East Timor. They were totally prepared to annexate it and to conquer it. And as a matter of fact, in October 75, 5 Australian journalists were covering the agitation by Indonesia, were murdered, brutally murdered by the Indonesians. And up to this day, we still haven't got back the remains of those journalists who were the first to alert the world to the Indonesian imminent invasion. And in December 75, on the 7th of December, thousands of Indonesian troops and air troops landed in Delhi across the territory, murdered as many people as they could, and they took over East Timor until 1999. 24 years of murder, rape, you name it. It was one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. In 1999, the United Nations decided to call a referendum to decide whether East Timor would continue Indonesian or become independent. Overwhelmingly, they decided on independence, and the Indonesians and the local militia set fire to every single building in the territory, and they killed another few thousand in those days. It was absolutely terrible. But Timor became independent on 2002, and still is one of the youngest countries in the world. Uh, I was one of the people who mostly wrote about East Timor. I wrote more than most people on East Timor. I was censored, even in Portugal after the revolution. I was still censored because nobody believed East Timor could become independent, and they did, fortunately. And I paid a high price in terms of my mental health, my sanity, and everything, because I was one of the few people believing that East Timor could become independent. And I've got no regrets. I love Timor. I love their people. But I'm not happy with East Timor. They got too much money, but there's corruption, and the people are still as poor as they were under Portuguese rule. The political elite lives in luxury. They've got all the goods, all the cars, and the wonderful buildings, and they travel. They've got everything, and the people still work in primitive conditions in the country. Delhi has expanded from 25,000 to 250,000 people. But every time it rains, it's fully flooded. And so the infrastructure hasn't been built, and the people still suffer. I wasn't never invited to go back, probably they used my services as a journalist for their purpose, for their aims, and once they became independent, they didn't need me anymore. That's why I never went back. No regrets, but it hurt. And I was able to keep in touch with this timor. I organized 2 international colloquia every single year since 2001, and I was able to bring some dancing groups from East Timor to our colloquia, which was great. And I still keep in touch with writers, with artists, and I still keep in touch with Timor. Part of me stay there. It was my first motherland, chosen by me. It still is very dear, and I love the people. I love their work, their paintings. They are wonderful paintings, full of color, full of energy. And it's a different culture, it's a different people, and I'm still very much in love with them after 45 years since I left. And I've got the flag just behind me with the Australian flag. And every time I can, I talk about East Timor. And I appreciate the opportunity that Susanna and Gonzalo gave me to talk about East Timor. It's not very often that I've got this opportunity to try to sum up all these years in half an hour, which we have reached by now, which was the time allocated. So I'm open to any question, any doubts. I should have spoken more about arts and so on, but I've got a bit carried away. So I'm totally at your disposal to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chris. Before I let my students ask a question, I want to ask you a question, which has to do with arts and the traditional ties. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's the fabric that is such a iconic element from Timor, at least for me as a Portuguese, a continental Portuguese. The ties, the fabric is very important. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there are certain regions, and we've seen a few pictures in those movies where they were making them. It's a very elaborate, intricate way of weaving various colors, various patterns, and they all use it. It's still the traditional dress, both for men and for women, and there's also a ceremonial ties, which is used around the neck. I forgot to bring them here, but I've got something else here that I would mention. The filigree work in silver. This one is a bit old, but you can see this is a typical silver work. The ties vary from region to region. They've got different colors from one county to another. But the fabrication is still the same as it was in the 19th century. It hasn't changed. It's all manual, wooden equipment, and they use their feet to work like they used to do it in weaving. Here in Portugal as well, we just saw some some of them walking now with their sarongs, with their lippers, the ties, and it's expensive these days to get one. I just replaced one of mine that had more than 40 years, and I paid a lot because everything now they use the US dollar for their currency, and everything now it's very costly. But in those days, everything was extremely cheap and very accessible for anyone to purchase.
Okay, so do you have any questions that we would like to make to Chris about his experience in Timor or anything about Timor or any other thing that you would like to know based on what we were hearing throughout the presentation? Good.
Do you have like an email or someplace we could contact you? Just because I have questions that I think would probably take too long to answer here.
Can you make a short one?
Not really. I wanted to know more specifically about the Japanese occupation of East Timor, because I looked into it a little bit and I could find some, but I was wondering if you had more knowledge of that period.
Mm-hmm. Chris, how long, when did it start the occupation? How long it was?
It was 42 to 45, and Portugal was not in the war. It was neutral like Switzerland, but it had to withstand the Japanese occupation. It was the only territory, the only Portuguese territory occupied, and the Australians tried to resist, but they were kicked out as well as the Dutch. The other half of the island was still Dutch. Don't forget that Indonesia only became independent after the Second World War, thanks to the Japanese. The Japanese helped them a lot, and they were brutal. And all the movies you can see from the Second World War, they were extremely brutal in Asia, in Mongolia, in China, in Vietnam, and in East Timor. They were in Malaysia. They were absolutely terrible. There's a few books by Australian authors who live there. I met personally some of those diggers, the Australian Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Corps, who fought in East Timor. I still met a few of them that were still alive, and they told me atrocious stories of how the Japanese treated the Timorese. And the only good thing that the occupation had, it was those roads that you are watching now. Those are Japanese roads. The Portuguese didn't build them, but the Japanese left them, and 30 years later they were still there.
Questions, people? You want to ask anything about arts? Visual arts? Nazim?
What were some of the interesting art practices you saw while you were there? Whether it was painting or sculptures, or art that could be used in daily life, so chairs and things like that. A lot of the stuff that we saw from Angola and Mozambique were things that could be used, like the chair that you showed us, stuff like that.
I didn't hear most of it. It was really trembling, the sound. Can you repeat or summarize it?
I was just asking, what were some of the your favorite visual arts that you saw when you were there, maybe tribal or indigenous practices, or art that was used. So some of the art that we saw for Mozambique and Angola, there were chairs and things that were used in the home. So did you see anything that was that stood out to you that was different than other places?
Yeah, the silver filigree is totally different. Even different from the Portuguese filigree, which traditionally was the best in the world, so they say. The Timorese made amazing miniatures of sacred objects and small boxes, jewel boxes, and so on, as small as this, in silver filigree. That was the most extraordinary thing, considering the means and the technical means and instruments that they had to do it. They had lots of woodwork, but I mean, I've traveled so much in Asia, in Indonesia, and in other countries. It was not outstanding. It was good, but not outstanding. But the filigree was absolutely superb. And as I said, the ties, the weaving, it's totally different from Indonesia. It's different. It's livelier. It's different.
Thank you.
Thank you. She said, thank you, Chris. Any other questions? How many of you have ever heard about Timor, East Timor, so until today? No, that's me. Only two?
I only heard half of it.
Oh, I asked them, no, I asked them if, how many of them have heard about Timor until today, and
Oh.
only two have had heard about it. Any questions, guys? Susanna, you want to make a question?
Yes, so Chris, right now, where are you?
I'm, as I normally say jokingly, I started in the far eastern part of the Portuguese Empire in East Timor, and I'm gonna end my days on the far western part of the old empire, which by chance is the closest to the United States of America. I'm in the Azores, right in the middle of the Atlantic, the land of Atlantis.
All
So
right.
yeah, and now I have a question for you, Chris. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned that you love Timor arts because they are plants of colors and energy. So my question is, do come these colors and that energy that you mentioned, because during your talk we didn't see colors and things like that. So do it come from this energy that you mentioned?
Let me answer it in a different manner.
Please.
When when I said that they were different and they didn't feel pain, there's one image that struck me from the very beginning. Still under the occupation of the Indonesians, we saw kids running with their parents up the mountains at night, being filmed by a cameraman, and they would tumble. They would normally a Western child would cry, and they were absolutely silent all the way up the mountain, without a cry, without a tear, without anything. Their capacity to withstand pain is out of this world, and and that's also colorful.
Um, I would like to ask you, Chris, please, and I know this could be an emotional question for you, So you mentioned something related to the color of the lips.
Yeah, they chew a mixture of areca. Areca is tobacco-like leaf, and they just chew it with a special mix, and it looks like blood, and it's dripping from their lips. And my first impression when I landed and I saw blood dripping from their lips, I was astounded. And they explained to me that's the placebo against anger, and they still use it. Uh, the they still use leaves of areca with oh, what's the name of it? Calviva. How do you say Calviva in English?
Alviva? I don't know.
Calviva.
Like chalk.
Ah,
Hold on.
It's not chalk. It's more than that. But it's a mix they make with areca, and they chew it and they chew it and they chew it, and they disguise the hunger with that.
Is it like limestone or?
Yeah, it's kind of like limestone. Yeah, I'm trying to find that as well. Can't find it.
Yeah, it shows quick lime, so I'm thinking that's like.
Lime?
Something related to like limestone.
It's related to limestone, Chris. Is that it?
Limestone. That's it. That's it.
thank you, Chris.
Welcome. My pleasure.
All right, Chris, we're gonna wrap it up. Thank you so much for your description of Timor and your narrative about your time there. I am sure that June is gonna contact you with more questions about it.
Feel free.
So you got people interested, which is good. It's certainly something that even for myself, I mean, and I'm more familiar with Timor than usually people are out here, but even to me was a very interesting description. And
It was very hard to try to summarize and make it interesting
Yeah.
and try to cover all bases within 30 minutes. But I tried to give my own impressions in a very succinct way and as as shortened as possible. My book on East Timor has got 3,670 pages, so it's a bit hard.
what's the name of your book? I can put it on here because I know you have at least a volume in English, right?
Yeah, it's a trilogy. The first volume is in Portuguese. I'll send you via mail the links for all
Okay.
3 volumes, and the first one was in English and Portuguese, was my MA, and then the second volume and the third one didn't come out in print. They only came out in digital.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate your time.
Okay.
We all
Thank you. Oh, thank you for your attention and the kindness of your invitation.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much. See you Wednesday.
Okay. Bye.
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 Should I press stop? Susanna? I don't know how you do this Zoom. Stop recording?
Stop recording.
Stop recording. Yes.